Everyone. So glad to be here with Eugene to co-moderate this panel. And today we are really honored to have three experts who are innovating across industry, government, and academia. So Eugene, do you want to kick off the introductions?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So first of all, we have Siddha Ganju. She's a senior data scientist at NVIDIA. She's been working on self-driving vehicles, medical instruments, and deep learning. And she's also been involved with the NASA FDL as an AI advisor, with Deep Vision, with CERN, authored Aureli's practical deep learning book. She's been published in all of venues. She's a passionate advocate for diversity and inclusion in technology. She's on Forbes 30 Under 30. And yeah, there's just a lot going on in Siddha's background.
There's a lot.
So hopefully you'll learn even more about her wisdom when she talks. I am going to over to you, Prachi, to introduce.
Yeah, and we have Dr. Newton Campbell, who's a senior principal solutions architect specializing in AI, and through SAIC, Newton currently serves as an AI subject matter expert on NASA Langley Research Center's Office of the CIO and their data science team. There, Newton leads the development of several programs in urban air mobility, geomagnetism, virtual reality, HPC for earth sciences. And before NASA, Newton, you did a lot of R&D in support of Department of Defense and intelligence communities. And again, just like Siddha, very diverse, active member of the Planetary Society, Philosophical Society of Washington, and IEEE.
And finally, Dr. Mariela Alfonzo is an internationally renowned leader and speaker. She has 20 plus years under her belt of a focus on understanding the built environment and the way that it affects us and our communities and our environmental outcomes. She is the founder and CEO of State of Place, which is an AI-driven urban design, data and predictive analytics software that basically helps city makers create more just and thriving communities. She was named one of the Urban Land Institute's 40 Under 40 Best Young Land Use Professionals, and she's a New Cities Foundation Placemaking Fellow. Just fantastic lineup of panelists today. I'm honored to be with you all today. And let us get things started with, let's dive right into the technical stuff. So Mariela, could you share a few things about your machine learning work that you've done in the land space, whether it's oceans, forests, urban areas, agriculture, just what were some of the exciting moments for you? What have you been up to?
Yeah, no, thanks so much. And it's so great to be with all of you here. I will make a disclaimer that I think out of everybody here, I'm the least techie person. My background is in social science, and my work has really been around quantifying the links between urban design, behavior, and value, and using this evidence-based approach to advocate for more livable, equitable, and sustainable places. And so the problem that I've been focused on for 20 years is really how do you collect this kind of urban design data, which is very micro scale, things like sidewalks, benches, crosswalk markings, all things that seemingly don't matter, but add up to actually impacting pretty much every different aspects of our quality of life. And there's no national inventory of this kind of data. It's been very difficult to collect. When I first started 20 years ago, we were doing it pen and paper, out in the field. And so we've kind of throughout the years been adding more technology to facilitate the data collection process. First with just a data collection app, then being able to use digital images virtually so we didn't have to do it in field. But we were still really limited giving this data to cities, because what we were doing was aggregating this at the time, almost 300 different aspects of the built environment into a score that we now call the State of Place Index, which measures walkability and livability. And we had all sorts of forecasting models that tied that to different aspects of value. So we were able to kind of help city makers use this data to identify which specific urban design changes to make to maximize quality of life, but project by project. So we couldn't really give them citywide data. And so 4 years ago, we began looking at machine learning techniques, specifically visual machine learning, to really begin to automate this and solve this really difficult challenge. And 2 years ago, we hit kind of our eureka moment with, actually automating a data collection process using a combination of visual machine learning, very much focused on convolutional neural networks, and also just other machine learning techniques to create automating 125 of those features. And we have a proxy algorithm that basically is the exact same that we used to get when we did the data collection manually. We can now do this all automated. So this really has helped us create this complete citywide picture. Some people call it a digital twin, of what's working and what's not at a super micro scale level that most cities just have no real understanding of. So that's what we've been really excited about.
Awesome, thank you, Mariela. Siddha, what about you? Can you share some things? What has your geospatial machine learning work been about?
Yeah, so thank you for having me here. I think I'd like to start off by talking about what I consider one of the most compelling moments, and that really reflected, science without borders for me. And so I think sometime in the past 2 years, NASA ETCI put out a competition on flood segmentation. And, I'm pretty enthusiastic about open source machine learning. And so another open source machine learning enthusiast, Sayak, and we basically started competing in this competition purely from a data science perspective, not really knowing anything about floods and satellite data, but we had a lot of hunger. We wanted to learn about this a lot, and ultimately, try to do at least a little bit in improving the state of the flood segmentation pipelines. And, we have all recently seen that flooding is extremely topical. There are mass floods in India, in Austria, Germany, Australia, and so many more countries. And so, we started out basically scouring the internet for information. We got the Google Cloud Platform team to donate some NVIDIA V100 machines where we could run experiments. And over the summer, we were able to, set up some new benchmarks that really improved the state of flood segmentation. And we used a new technique called semi-supervised learning, which really isn't as data hungry. So you don't need a lot of annotated data. And when we started out on this journey, we really thought that the best case scenario would be that we would get a paper publication out of it, right? But little did we know that this work would really be welcomed with open arms. And I really give due credit to all of those international teams who tested, adopted our solution, and incorporated their own ideas in order to make it successful, which truly I think was just beyond our wildest dreams. And so a quick example of that is the Deep Learning Institute at NVIDIA. They made an educational module around disaster risk monitoring and flood detection. And just within 2 weeks of launching that course, we had almost 1,000 data scientists take that course. We had some more incredible contributions by UNOSAT, which is the satellite team within the UN, and that's focused on disaster risk and monitoring as well. We had companies like Orange Business Services. They took up the solution, offered it through their cloud services. And, it really had a downstream effect when a company called Balcony Labs, that's headquartered right here in Berkeley, California, they took it up, deployed it all the way to handheld mobile devices and deployed it across 5 different countries. And so, you see this journey from people just trying to figure out what's something happening in floods, all the way to it actually being deployed on somebody's cell phone device, and them learning, okay, what's the evacuation plan? What do I do next? And that really helps them make more educated and informed decisions. And so the takeaway for me here has really been to work with stakeholders who can, accelerate the impact of this work. So that's what my learning experience has been, and that's what I've been up to in the recent past.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Siddha. What about you, Newton? What's your spatial ML life been like?
Oh wow, these two are hard to follow. It's quite impressive. My me diving into the geospatial space and even the climate space was a bit unintentional. As Prachi said, I used to do quite a bit of work for the Defense Department. Came up early in my career doing a lot of work for DARPA. That's the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. It's the other agency besides NASA that came out of Sputnik. Back when I was working in that space, we did a lot of geospatial detection of anomalies and things like that on the power grid, and combining that information with information that we saw as far as sensors go on the power grid, and used a lot of that information to talk about defending the grid. One of our key findings on those programs was just the level of security that a grid of microgrids would get you to, and that was sort of my first foray into that. We talked to some of the senior leaders in DoD about that, even briefed a little bit of Congress as well, just on the scientific and quantitative measures that tell you that, hey, this is more secure if you can get to a grid that's chock full of renewables, with a solid backbone, but a grid of microgrids essentially. Fast forward to getting to NASA, I was a bit more intentionally in the climate space. So as Prachi said, I'm working under the OCIO at NASA on the data science team, and we're effectively a group of AI SMEs who go to different projects across the agency and help out with artificial intelligence, or sometimes leads projects in artificial intelligence. A recent larger effort that came across my desk, or a larger concern that came across my desk, was the question of, can we reuse some of our satellite assets for unintended use cases? So to give you an example of that, NASA has deployed well over 70 Earth science missions, depending on how you go about counting them, since the 1960s. Well, many of those missions have very specific purposes with very specific instruments on board. Take the Calypso satellite. It is specifically deployed to measure aerosols in clouds, for instance. Well, that's an important mission in understanding climate, but some of those detectors, what we've recently been discovering is that some of those detectors, some of those capabilities can be used for alternative use cases, but with the help of just a little bit more data and some machine learning. So we took that into account, and among our data science team started to work on and look at some of the open data that was out there. We came across coral reefs as an example of a data set that is well aligned with specific locations that are out there in the world, and that could be surveyed by some of our satellites in terms of just understanding whether or not they're at specific locations. That actually helps folks who are attempting to restore coral reefs around the world in anticipation of them potentially going extinct by 2050. So I had NASA get together with a group at Georgia Tech to host a practicum where they would use machine learning to take our NASA public data that is offered by the ESDIS, the Earth Sciences data folks, and unify that data with open source coral reef data that we found out in the wild. We brought in Coral Vita, a recent Earthshot Prize winner, who's helping to restore coral about 50 times faster than we can currently do it. And they basically mentored the students over the course of a semester to successfully be able to use one single satellite that was never meant to do this, to basically use that satellite in order to map coral reefs around the world. And now we're prepping to, we're just published a presentation. We're getting ready to publish a report on that, and we're prepping to do an additional effort in the fall with many more of our satellites. So that's just one of the many efforts that we've gotten to do so far at NASA among the data science team.
That's great.
Yeah,
That's fascinating to hear about some of these use cases. And as we think of the government and state and local pushing the envelope of R&D, originally it was pushed by some of the big tech companies as well. So real quick, maybe a quick round across all of you to maybe just quickly talk about what do you think are some of the holy grail problems of geospatial ML, and what do you think like a revolution in this space might look like? So maybe, starting with you, Mariela.
Yeah, I mean, I think about this slightly differently. Because there's so many different nuances and difficulties that probably my machine learning scientists could speak to better. But the way I approach this is, like what is the problem that we're trying to solve? So I think that part of the problem that I think we need to address in the machine learning world, or just, kind of data scientists in general, is to kind of think a little bit more like a social science, right? To think about this from a human-centered approach and start off with understanding what that problem is. And so I think that requires us really getting deep into the stakeholders' mind, understanding their perspective, understanding what barriers they have to whatever value it is that we think we can help them unlock using machine learning. So to me, it's more about not so much which techniques we need to address, but rather, the processes that we need to, I think, implement and maybe, collaborate across social science and data science, which is like how I've put my team together. Because there's a lot of stuff that you all can do and speak to that is like, woo. But I feel like I am the person that sort of molds the amazing energy that my data science and AI team has. Like, okay, well, you could do this for R&D, but like, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? Because that's what I've spent my last 20 years, is really understanding that problem and coming up with solutions that is really about harnessing that power of technology as a means and not the end. So I know that that's not a super techie answer, but I do think that it's something that we need to always think about in tackling that holy grail approach. And that's the revolution that I would want to see, is that, and I think that that's going to, what's needed for that is this much more transdisciplinary cross sector approach. Not just in how we work together, but how we fund things. And by doing so, then we can craft a narrative and a story that helps everyday people understand why this technology is not just this nerdy thing that we all get super into. It actually can help people's everyday lives in ways that count. So weaving that narrative is really important too, in my opinion.
Absolutely. I think that multidisciplinary approach is where actually the magic starts happening. So couldn't agree more. How about you, Siddha?
Yeah, so I think your question is kind of two parts. So let me address the challenges first, and then we can get to the big tech part. And, in the challenges, I completely agree with what Dr. Mariela said, that even when we consider some of the most basic challenges, like in geospatial domain, you have incredibly large sized images, right? Loading them onto a system takes a lot of expertise, right? That expertise may not be available throughout. So how do you develop code and programs in such a way that accessing the right pipelines, making sure that you're making optimum use of whatever CPU, GPUs you have, is possible, right? And so making this seamless and making it more accessible can only happen when there is an interdisciplinary team, because you learn about the challenges and expertise from both sides. And I think that is really a watershed moment in geospatial and all of these, interdisciplinary areas where AI is being looked at as one possible solution that can be added to the portfolio of everything that's possible. And then back to the first part of the question, which is big tech, right? Of course, that is one way to fuel progress. But I think there's also another aspect of it where, at a more grassroots level, there are so many startups, so many country-specific startups that are evaluating their unique environments and figuring out what are the solutions and how do I adapt universally known facts and technologies to just focus and help me solve my solution. And I think it is ultimately those masses that drive the demand even for those big tech companies. So as an example, agriculture is such a huge backbone for so many countries, and now we have so many young companies, startups that are operating in this domain, right? For example, there's a startup in India called Fasal, which does smart farming, right? And according to their publications, they have, I think, deployed around, like the IoT devices are deployed maybe on acres and acres of land. But the more important thing, and I think what's key here, is that they've also saved 3 billion liters of water, right? So you want to have wins not just in the core domain, but in all other areas, right? And so the students even are getting inspired, right? There is a team at IIIT Hyderabad, which is focused on smart farming specifically for the maize crop, because that is a staple diet in India and so many other different areas. So I think we have a lot of grassroots level, a lot of mass level impact also happening that's really driving the adoption and the demand from the big tech areas. And all of it is, again, due to the interdisciplinary work.
That's great. How about you, Newton?
Well, I got now that just to piggyback on what Siddha said, like it made me think about something when you talked about the students. And to me, now I have two holy grails, right? One, I think, is having as many students as possible understand how they can take part in this overall, in this change that we're seeing in the technological landscape. We've invested billions of dollars now in climate over the last several years alone. But with that, we have to have not just the talent, not just training computer scientists, but actually showing them how to actually dive into this field and do research. Georgia Tech, I mentioned them earlier, that I had them partner with NASA. I have done, I want to say 4 going on 5 semesters with the Georgia Tech practicum alone. Not to mention other work that I do with other universities. Of any generation I've ever seen, this is the most passionate I've ever seen a young generation be about a particular subject matter. So if we could, I think, to me, one of the holy grails would be getting as many students as possible, whether that is through a national civil service program that helps pay for college or university, or something that comes right after college to help you out with loans, et cetera, getting as many of them as possible to help work on these problems. Because quite frankly, at this point, even in computer science in the United States, we still do not have the workforce to actually address all of these issues. So compelling people, enticing people to actually become a part of this workforce, potentially people who fall outside of the stereotypical characteristics that fall into the workforce, I think would actually give me a lot of faith in the prospect of us meeting our climate goals through technology. The other thing I was going to bring up, though, when I originally thought about this question, was metadata. So results in geospatial machine learning, much like any other kind of machine learning, it's all about the data. It is all about the data that you have access to, and sort of the beyond NP hard problem that you have with climate is that your application changes so subtly, and when applications change, the data that is actually required of you must change. In the next go around with the coral reef data that I mentioned, there will be a shift in the actual data sets that we need, and students will have to go, students and some of our folks will have to go in again and figure out, is this the proper data set? Do these things align? Is the data clean? What sensors were used, et cetera, et cetera. What we lack that we never really gave true thought to when we initially started this sort of big data phase of technology that we're in, is a true and honest, let's say, trusted third party. Imagine something that could that you could effectively search through, something structured, something well defined that you could effectively search through let's just say in the geospatial space alone, that could tell you about the locations that a particular data set covers, that can tell you, what kinds of instruments were used to do a particular measurement. Is it human-based? Is it machine-based? Et cetera, et cetera. Imagine having trusted third parties on the internet that would be able to do that. Not only do you open the door up for me as a researcher to be able to go in, quickly search through something like that and identify the data sets that are necessary for my new application, you also allow new complex intelligent agents to do the same thing. That I think would be one of the things that I would significantly invest in right now, especially as so many different groups, as Siddha said, are walking into this space. So many different startups are starting new projects in this space and contributing to the world of open data. We need trusted brokers that we can actually search through to quickly adopt to these new challenges.
Yeah, thank you, Newton. That's super interesting. Indeed, I think that's something that many people who are not involved with geospatial ML don't realize, like just how rich and more complex this data is. Than like it's not just photographs of the Earth from a satellite. There's so much more to it. It's very, very interesting and very complex. So you're right that definitely like metadata is one way that we could make this better. So I'd like to ask a question to Siddha. Siddha, can you tell us basically what role does geospatial machine learning play in NVIDIA's strategy? And are there any exciting fundamental developments in hardware or modeling techniques on NVIDIA's side that are particularly relevant to climate?
Yeah, thank you, Eugene. So I think I'd like to first address this question a little bit more broadly. I honestly see NVIDIA as a company, and obviously I do work at NVIDIA, but I see NVIDIA as a company that, to me, makes the quote, standing on the shoulders of giants a reality. And the reason why this is the case is many data scientists and developers can recognize that NVIDIA ultimately provides a platform that others can build on. And that really relates to all of the scientific computation and visualization that you have. A lot of these support satellite imagery as well. And of course, that's a part of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And so, all kinds of challenges, climate action, environmental monitoring, disaster response, etc. And so NVIDIA is really enabling users from all walks of life, governments, private researchers, startups, even everyday citizen scientists to make their own processing much, much more faster. Now, speaking as a data scientist who has worked in this field before, I think there are a whole spectrum of products and optimizations that are available. And one thing that I really like to point out is that these optimizations, you can really see them at the most fundamental or the most atomic level, but also at a really big picture and future impact level. And so talking about the commitment and the adherence to a greener environment, you can see it in one of our newer GPUs that has come out, which is the new liquid-cooled NVIDIA A100 GPU, which actually requires, I think, 30% less energy than its equivalent air-cooled counterpart, obviously providing the same amount of performance. And all of this goes towards building the next generation of data centers, right? And this has an impact on our very own home planet, Earth, of course. But when we look at space, we think of deploying NVIDIA Jetson modules within these radiation-tolerant enclosures, and they can be used for hyperspectral imaging. Hyperspectral imaging has a lot of monitoring use cases, smart satellite use cases. A quick example of that would be, when we are sending data from the satellite down to the Earth, data transfer can become very expensive. Now, if we pick and choose what are the images, what are the frames to send, we can be, the data transfer could save us a lot of energy as well as be less expensive. Another example is the FISAT satellite that was launched by the European Space Agency recently, and that has a flood detection system on board that's powered by machine learning, and it was developed by the NASA AI Accelerator Frontier Development Lab. And as we see these kind of developments are obviously more core and more fundamental. But when we look at the future, I think there are also more long-term solutions that are being developed today. And so let's just kind of take a minute to recognize that also is kind of a two-part solution. One, the fact that, when we do weather prediction, that usually spans from hours to days. But when we look at climate, that's usually months to decades long. And that also means that we have an incredible amount of data to sift through, right? As Dr. Newton mentioned, satellites have been launched since the 1960s. So that's 60 to 65 years ago. And since then, the number of satellites, the number of countries putting out satellites has only increased. And so it's really a moment for us to process all of this data and see what are the insights and knowledge that we can gather. But I think as we all recognize today, making sense of such great amount of data and the metadata is not easy, right? You do need intelligent technology to, first of all, make sense of that data. And you also need a supercomputer that can do the heavy number crunching for you. And so NVIDIA is also kind of taking part in both of those aspects. Recently, a team at NVIDIA developed a physics-informed machine learning technology called the Forecast Net. And what the Forecast Net is doing, it's basically collecting hundreds and hundreds of machine learning models individually, and then combining all of their collective knowledge much, much more faster than anything could do before. And so at the end of the day, what we're basically trying to do is do all of this computation much more quickly, with much more precision, much more accuracy, which is key, right? And of course, in order to run this on a really, really powerful supercomputer, NVIDIA also announced the bring up of what will be the world's most powerful AI supercomputer called Earth-2. And that supercomputer is only aimed to predicting climate change and helping us understand what's next for the future and how do we prepare for its impact. And so I think there are so many, diverse applications, and it's really going to power all of the workflows and the lifestyles of the future that we are going to see.
Thank you, Siddha. I really appreciate that futuristic lens that you apply to this. I think it's a lot of food for imagination. And pulling that thread a little bit further, Mariela, when we talk about a city context, there are multiple aspects of what a future city truly needs, maybe from a sustainability standpoint, livability, workability, and all of the work that you are doing through your company's State of Place directly applies to that. So can you give us maybe one example that talks about how the predictive analytics helps this mission and overcome some of those challenges, just to make it real for our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. So one interesting case study comes to mind is our work with the city of Philadelphia. We started working with them right after COVID, in the midst of the uprising of the Black Lives Matter movement after the murder of George Floyd. It was clear to them that there was inequitable access to the built environment that was a factor in both what they were seeing from a COVID perspective in terms of who was getting COVID and disparate outcomes we were seeing in communities that had been historically marginalized, as well as all of the many, structurally racist factors that were being brought to light with the Black Lives Matter movement. So we saw these things as linked together, and they were very much tied to historically racist planning policies. The city knew all of this, but they felt like they needed a way to quantify this, and also just be more precise in thinking about how do you actually invest in places that need it most, and how do you do it in a way that still fits within their budget, right? Because you still have that limitation, right? But then also in a way that builds trust, because these, the communities that we were focusing on have been burned multiple times in multiple different ways. by previous city governments, right? And also different aspects of different governments, at multiple scales. So what we did was, because we at that point, we had automated the data collection process using the visual machine learning processes, we were able to collect this data at scale for them. It was a pilot project, so we just did a third of the city, which covered 17 different counties, including areas that had been historically divested, and then areas that were higher invested and everything in between. So we collected the state of place data, which, as I mentioned, is 125 different micro scale features, sidewalks, benches, different public spaces and things like that, extracted from digital street level images. And this gave us the ability to give them the state of place index, the score that measures how walkable and just generally the quality of the built environment for every single street block within those 17 zip codes. Ended up being over 12,000 blocks just for that area. And then what we ended up doing for them, because we had the ability now to collect so much data, we created custom predictive models for them. So when we first started State of Place, we had the connection between state of place and various economic development factors, that showed that investing in place actually had an economic value. But the narrative we wanted to weave here was that it had other aspects of value. So we created new predictive models that tied state of place to COVID outcomes. So for example, out of 100 points that we measure state of place, if you increased it by 5 points, there was 1 fewer death for COVID. Increased by 10 points, 5 fewer people in the hospital. 20 points, 0.5% positivity, lowered, right? We did the same thing for heat, where we looked at, in particular, access to public spaces. If we had a 10 point on that specific dimension within the index, you had a differential of heat wave of 0.5 degrees, which starts to add up, right? And we did the same thing for homicides, looking at areas with above average versus below average, state of place indices. We were looking at differences of 8.7 times homicides for player areas that were lower average. So real life outcomes tied to these different aspects of the built environment. So the goal then, okay, that's very academic-y, right? So the goal then with our software is that you can, they were able to then create priorities of which specific built environment areas to invest in and where to actually improve those different quality of life outcomes in very targeted areas within the city. Use our scenario tool, which is kind of like our SimCity tool, with the community to actually model out what these changes could be and test them in real time. There's multiple different ways to improve the built environment. So this allows the community to be a part of that, which really helps that trust factor that that as mentioned before. And then ultimately quantify what the benefit would be, so that if they don't have the funds, that they could go, knock on the federal government door, look at the new IIJA money, ARPA funds, et cetera, to be able to justify these are the benefits that can accrue if you actually make these investments. So that's the kind of work that we've been doing, and hoping to do more of it.
Yeah, thank you, Mariela. So in our remaining couple of minutes, I have a last question to Newton. Yeah, Newton, do you have, what would be your recommendations of some specific, online resources or organizations or classes or something to a young professional who wants to learn how to get into geospatial machine learning?
I mean, class, one of the best things about, like I said earlier, that the younger generation is really, driven. They're really into this. One of the best things about, the environment that they're coming up in right now is there's just so much, free and open courseware out there. There are MOOCs. I've learned myself when I've had to take on new subject matters from places like Coursera and Safari and all of these different places that many of those young professionals and students usually have free accounts for. So I would certainly take advantage of that. But when you're thinking about what you want to learn next, and I obviously can specifically talk to computer scientists and the computer science experience. If this is a space that you're looking at really diving into, you have enough of the computer science knowledge, understand the climate piece. So in every single time I've had to address any real, give any issue related to climate in any real way. The tricky part wasn't figuring out, oh man, what algorithm am I going to use for this, or what model am I going to use for that? It was learning the application. When I did power grids, I went and learned power engineering. That's what I focused my efforts on. That led to so many different transitions and actual effective products coming out of the research, because we actually went and adapted to, I promoted this among my team, we adapted to that subject matter, right? We have the background, we're confident enough in the background. If you've gone through 4 years or 2 years or 6 years of computer science, you have the background to address some of these other issues. So really think about that when you're diving into these other spaces. The same thing happened for me right now with electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicles. The same thing has happened with the coral space. Whenever I dive into a new project, it's not just thinking about whatever machine learning technology or algorithm I want to apply to it. It's what is the problem that the people that are in this space are having. That's the thing that really that will really allow you to make effective change, and will make you very, very valuable as someone who's trying to meet the needs of quote unquote customers in that space. So yeah, that would be what I would recommend. There's plenty of courses and materials out there. You folks can find them. It's more about how you go about that investigation that matters. And also, when you run into an issue that someone wants you to investigate, have a back and forth with them. Let them know that you're investigating this thing. Am I investigating the right aspects of this domain? That could save you a lot of time and trouble, and make for very effective innovation or research.
Yeah, thank you so much, Newton. I guess this is another case where like getting into climate requires you to be a little bit more in touch with the needs of the physical world than many of us in tech are used to, which is both a challenge and an opportunity to learn something really interesting and different.
I tell people I tell my junior employees this all the time. A high school student or a middle school student can run a machine learning model. That's not the hard part of this. It's getting to know what other people need, becoming familiar enough with it to actually apply the things that you've learned.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. We are over time, so we need to wrap up. I wish we had another couple of hours, but sadly we don't. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. Thank you, Prachi, for co-moderating. Thanks, everybody, for attending. And see everybody tomorrow.
Thanks. Take care.